Anthony Flaccavento.
Thanks, Alan, and I'm glad to be here. And I have to say sort of a slightly awkward thing at the beginning. One thing I'm going to mention in my brief time is about value chains, building value chains. I'm only going to talk about that in passing. But I authored a toolkit on building value chains, kind of a how-to, which I put outside, and I'm delighted that about 6 or 7 of them disappeared, except they're $15 each. So if you did happen to get one, and you so choose to, if you want to keep it, you can write a check to my organization for that. Thanks. It's always good to start with your audience on the defensive. I think that's that's the Sicilian approach to public speaking. So I come at this from 25 years or so on the ground in community development work, and more recently as a consultant around the country, but also grounded as a small-scale commercial organic farmer in Southwest Virginia, raising about 50 different types of fruits and vegetables on a small farm, selling, including heirloom tomatoes. But I'm going to talk more broadly, obviously, this morning, broadly and quickly. And what I want to do is, as I thought through the topic and looked at the other panels and their topics, I identified what, for me, as Kate and others have said, it could be many, many things, but identified kind of 3 challenges at 3 distinctly different levels, kind of the overlapping scales that Kate talked about, and then some of what some folks in our area in Appalachian, Virginia, and Tennessee, as well as other parts of the country, are doing to respond. So the first challenge, and certainly Fred talked about this quite a bit, as did Eric, is this long-term declining land base. Really, you could say the limits of the ecosystem, and with that comes increased ecological and economic pressure. So Herman Daly, I'm sure many of you know, the former World Bank economist, he talks about how basically at the founding of our country, we could afford to practice what he calls empty world economics because there was only about 750 million people on the planet. But now we're in a situation where we should be practicing full world economics because there's nearly 7 billion of us, probably to rise to somewhere between 9 and 10. And that really changes the way we go about doing everything, not just food and farming. Translates into a lot of statistics. I won't do too many of these, but one that's pretty shocking and puts it fairly plainly in terms of productive land per person. Just 100 years ago, there was about 14 acres of farmland, of fisheries, of forestry land, things that could produce things for human beings. Now we're down to about 3.5. And by definition, that figure will get smaller because there'll be more people. So as Kate said, we really need to treasure that land. Now, where's all that land gone? Well, of course, again, the biggest thing is there's a lot more people sharing that land, but it's also what we've done with it. And when I was a wee lad in 1960, we had about 4 square feet of retail space per person in this country. Now we're up to 38. So that has many, many implications, one of which means we've paved over a lot of land, made it non-productive unless we completely rip that up. But in another sense, it's that many more opportunities to buy into that consumer culture that has become such a hallmark of sort of a defining feature of our culture. The growth model, of course, that's behind this, we could talk a lot about that. It could be a day-long seminar in and of itself easily enough. But I believe some of these figures came from World Watch, although I'm not sure of that right off the source of this. But if you look at this graph and realize that the blue bars are what the entire world now consumes in grain, oil, and coal, you look at the red bars, that's what China will be consuming in 2 more decades if they continue at their present and much celebrated pace of growth, more coal, more oil than the world now consumes in its entirety and almost all of the world's grain harvest. So we have these market incentives to do a number of things, including soil erosion and many other sort of economic externalities. In rural areas in particular, like Southwest Virginia and East Tennessee and much of the country, those market incentives often drive us to this type of an approach to our natural capital, which is that we overuse it. We take a lot off, we harvest it, and we undervalue it because we tend to send it away from our community, and somewhere between 75 and 90% of the economic value accrues far away to other people in other communities. So responding to that first challenge of this essentially declining this base of ecological capital, well, again, the local food movement, the sustainable ag and farming movement, the local economy movement is a lot about assets, building on your assets, rebuilding your assets, regenerating them. So a lot of farmers returning to some age-old practices like legumes to rebuild the soil biology, cover crops that not only build the soil biology but attract beneficial insects and create habitat for honeybees and others. looking to do all that. Farmers like Will Clark there in the green T-shirt, fifth-generation family farmer in Washington County, Virginia, who with his dad has transitioned that farm to kind of a model of sustainability, very much based on the Joel Salatin model, but with their own spin. And Will's a great spokesperson for it. So they raise beef cattle and hogs and sometimes poultry. And as Will says, their animals are happy every day but one. And Mike and Rebecca Hubbard also following that integrated multi-species basis and realizing that when you do that, when you begin to, and I obviously I can only show you little snippets of it, but that it is possible to have our cake and eat it too in some places at some time. So the Rodale study, and I think that Fred alluded to either the same study or a different one, shows that over time, low-till organic practices, in this case it was with grain, were actually showing higher yields over an 11-year study than conventional practices, while greatly building up the soil carbon and soil organic matter, which has multiple benefits. Similarly, people following these intensive grazing, multi-species livestock actually have more animals per acre, and yet they're reducing their inputs because, again, they're using the ecological capital in the right way. Second challenge, from the global kind of that we all face to something I would call more of a regional challenge. It can be national, but regional. And that is that when we start talking about local foods and sustainable foods, healthy foods and all of that, we have this issue that we have, generally speaking, in our country, strong demand, very strong demand, but the markets themselves tend to be dispersed, as is the supply. That is to say, particularly, again, this is a phenomenon in the rural part of the country, which is much of it. So the way we've gone about dealing with that sort of the rural-urban question over time, and the fact that the markets are concentrated here and the ability to supply the markets is dispersed, is we've created supply chains that are highly efficient. But there's a lot of negative consequences with the types of supply chains we've created. So you have hogs like this that we're all very familiar with, and most of us would be horrified by. You have the Immokalee farm workers. Lucas Benitez here has brought to light very successfully the plight of farm workers picking tomatoes, making 1 penny a pound, which means every ton of tomatoes you pick in the hot Florida sun, you make $20. So just that's part of a system that we don't see. It's part of a supply chain that ultimately puts a whole lot of food and a lot of other stuff in ubiquitous sort of abundance, where these big box stores make it seem that something must be right. Most things must be right because it's available to us all the time, every day of the year, and pretty cheaply. Responding to this challenge of concentrated markets and dispersed supplies. In our experience, and again, a lot of groups around the country beginning to do this, I think definitely farmers markets, CSAs, that type of direct market is a great place to begin and to continue. Tremendous potential, but in concert with something called value chains. That is to say, changing the supply chain so that they do what we want in terms of human welfare and the environment. Those farmers markets attract really a broad base of farmers, we're finding. It's not just sort of back to the landers selling to foodies, but it's a much broader base, again, at least in the small town areas that we're in Central Appalachia and Southern Virginia. I see the same thing in Wisconsin and Iowa. So you have all kinds of people. This is the Abington Farmers Market, a little town of 8,000 people, but a tremendous, over time, started out with 6 old fellers in pickup trucks on the side of the road, and now it's really a gathering place in the community as farmers markets have become all over the country. We have over 2,000 shoppers that come through with the population of 8,000 on a Saturday morning. And that's part of a much larger phenomenon of the growth of farmers markets. This graph is now very dated. We're well over 5,000 farmers markets around the country. But beyond farmers markets, there's a lot of farmers who just don't do farmers markets. They're not going to befriend a chef and learn to grow arugula. There's just and I know a lot of them, like this fellow Martin Miles, who was one of the first tobacco farmers to actually decide he needed to do something else. Bob Orr, again, a lifelong tobacco farmer, now puts out about a dozen acres of certified organic produce, as well as some of the free-range eggs. And I love this picture. John Mullins, who was one of the first tobacco farmers in our area to try certified organic produce. And you know, if you're going to talk about a transition of the food system, this is it, right in this photo here. When people like that are able and willing, with support, with technical assistance, and with the markets to make that transition, and very proudly to be part of it. Coming together, not so much as individuals, although that's always a big part of farming, but again, in networks of farming, as Fred was talking about, with the importance of networks where they're coming together to plan, to coordinate production as well as to look at varieties. And then that those networks are often supported. Here is the packing and grading facility that we built over time, started out in a barn and gradually built a facility that could grade and move larger volumes of produce to college dining services. Emory and Henry College recently started buying local grass-finished ground beef for the first time. It was kind of a breakthrough for us. A little private college, Virginia Tech. This picture is Ohio University. Different colleges around the country. You all are aware of that, purchasing from local and sustainable producers. And our biggest thing actually is retail, because in many senses there's certain challenges with schools and universities, the biggest one being seasonality. But if you can get into the retail market, then you can pretty well brand the product and sell at various times. So scaling up, not leaving behind farmers markets, but realizing there's got to be more than that. And then the last challenge that I'll discuss, we've got this global challenge of essentially a relatively fixed ecological base of capital, but more and more people. We've got these problems of accessing markets. And then we've got just the reality that I know I face as a small farmer, and a lot of people do, which is how can farmers secure a decent price and at the same time make food affordable? And one of the last questions in our last session got to some of this. And it's the $64,000 question. Many of you have probably seen this graph from the USDA economist Stuart Smith. If you haven't, it's basically our food dollars over the last century. It's not quite up to date. And you look at the beginning of the last century, the red section is what the percentage of our food dollars went to farmers. It was about $40 billion out of about 70. As we approached the end, farmers were still getting $40 billion, even though our food dollars were now up well over now several $100 billion a year. So farmers aren't getting much of it. It's going primarily to what happens after the product leaves the farm. That combined with another quite interesting challenge of our time in particular, which is just the inversion of food and health expenses. So we have, in 1960, we were spending about 17% of our average household income, this of course is average, on food, and only about 6% on health care, and now we're up to about 16 to 17% on health care and down to under 10% on food. So again, the question of price and affordability is a complex question. It's a question of social class and many other things, but it's also a question of where we're spending our money. The response to that is, first of all, to make our farms as productive as possible. And many farms are in this. This is a high tunnel, one of several on my farm, and this movement to sort of increase what you got to get more production out of it without diminishing its ecological capacity is part of that. Shared equipment. Our growers network purchased this little piece of equipment. It's called a mulch layer. It's beyond the means of most of our farmers. It's about $2,000 to $3,000. But as a shared piece of equipment, it allows you to very, very efficiently make raised beds that you can then plant in, and many farmers can share one or two of these things. What Michael Schumann calls import substitution, that we need to start cultivating businesses that we normally have been, at least for the last couple generations, bringing in. So this farmer converted an old tobacco greenhouse, he wasn't growing tobacco anymore, to raise certified organic transplants. And so now we need hundreds of thousands of those for the growers in our network. And then ultimately, in our experience, this idea of coordinating production to meet supply or to meet demand. So it's not just the fact that there's a lot of buyers who want this, but what specifically do the buyers want, and what of that can we grow? Who's going to grow it when? Who's doing the first? Who's doing the second? Who's doing the third planting? That's the kind of thing that we orchestrate and that I'm working with groups around the country. And it's a very effective way to avoid the peaks and valleys, the gluts that are such a feature of the food system. And then simultaneously with folks like Gus Schumacher in the back helping us to get going with EBT, again, even in small rural markets where food stamp clients can utilize their dollars there at the market. Also the Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program and many other features there. And the last thing I'll say is, in addition to different things that we can do, and there's some others I could talk about during the question and answer that we've tried to do to make food more affordable, is really the reality is that most Americans still can afford to pay more for their food. There's a very many million who can't, but there's quite a few who can. And through education, through farm tours, local meals, the media, getting people to realize that that's a good expenditure of their dollars. So I'll close with this, that I think too often in the organic sustainable movement we've oriented towards the niche, the cool latest thing, and we say no, really what we're talking about is a healthy local food economy of sort of ordinary food, or you might say extraordinary ordinary food for ordinary folks. Thanks.
Thanks, Anthony, for that great overview. And for a Virginian, you sure talk really fast. Just kidding. Please. So now we're going to hear a couple of perspectives from some two other producers. Angela.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm a farmer in Vermont, and a little background, I am also a literary agent in New York, specializing in food writing and cookbooks. So in terms of marketing our product, which is farmstead artisanal cheese, I had a really fortunate leg up in many contexts in New York City. I represent Mark Bittman, Chris Kimball, Jean-Georges Van Richten, lots and lots of people who got behind us. Not financially, not in any way except cheerleaders. My husband and I went to Vermont 10 years ago. We purchased a 300-acre defunct dairy farm. And in the course of deciding how we would work this wonderful piece of land, and we knew nothing about farming, by the way, we found out it was the first cheese-making co-op in Vermont. Now, that was back in the 1860s, and it was founded by a man named Consider Bardwell. And he was an entrepreneur, and they made cheddar cheese. Again, co-op, sort of factory farming. They brought milk from the local town and made cheese in what they called the cheese factory at the farm, and a railroad line ran through the property, and they shipped it weekly to Albany and Boston. So, loving cheese, loving food, I thought, we can do this. We're living in what I think of as the good food revolution, and I immediately fell hook, line, and sinker. We created a mission statement, which was basically to make world-class cheese from happy, healthy animals in a financially and environmentally sustainable way. I didn't want to just make cut cheese from my farm for myself. I wanted to work with local foodies, I guess, if you will. And I wanted to introduce our cheeses to the markets in New York City. My husband and I had to keep our day jobs to afford to do this. And it has been 10 years of a dark tunnel of hard work, of 2 and 3 jobs at one time. In New York for 3 days, selling books and trying to run the farm on the phone, and learning soil science. I knew a little bit about farming from my family in Pennsylvania, but dirt. I didn't know how absolutely crucial it is to have healthy soil in order to have clean, wonderful, nutritious, delicious milk, and hence cheese. I had to learn animal science. I bought 6 Swiss Alpine goats from a show farm in New Hampshire, and I'd never met a goat in my life till I transported those 6 girls across state lines in my car. They're very curious. They like to nibble your hair, and when they get nervous, they release a lot of urine. And they were nervous. So animal husbandry, soil science, food science. We hooked up with one of Vermont's more senior cheesemakers, a man named Peter Dixon, and he developed 6 cheeses for us that have proven to be world-class cheese. We enter all the competitions, and we finally, in 2008, reaped the rewards of some serious national recognition because of Peter's efforts. And we milk goats, Swiss Alpine dairy goats, who are officially called Oberhasli. And we milk 3 herds of Jersey cow's milk. Peter likes to work with one kind of cow, Jersey cow. Has a really high butterfat content, and it's super delicious. And we have actually 4 partner farms right in our town, and each one raises a maximum of 20 jerseys, and we purchase all of their milk. Peter Dixon cheesemaker, taught us that one of our mandates should be to help young farmers start dairying. We pay them $30 a hundredweight instead of $12 a hundredweight. We circulate the whey from the cheese. All of us feed the whey to pigs, and we're going to become part of a Vermont effort to market its pork by the cheesemakers all gathering and feeding their own whey to their pigs. I don't have to extol the virtues of Vermont because Amy Trubeck did it. We could not, without the infrastructure of that state. UVM jumped in and taught me about small ruminants and nutrition. I didn't have to pay a cent. I got to go up to UVM and sit there and have a one-on-one tutorial with Carol Delaney. The USDA arm called the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, jumped in, came down to the farm, taught us about all of their cost-sharing programs, how if they helped pay for fencing for the goats on pasture, we would create riparian buffer strips and plant native trees and help native birds survive. We are now going to close on something called the Grassland Reserve Program, and the USDA is buying an easement on all of our land so that we will perpetually keep it as grassland and never plant corn, soy, any annual anything. And we're happy to have it because it will help us do something that Amy referred to as well. We have never been able to meet the demand. Every year we could sell a lot more cheese than we make. And every time we increase our production, and to ground you in that, in 2009 and 2010 we produced 45,000 pounds of cheese. Sold it all out. And we are now going to increase to 70,000 pounds. And to do that, we have to put in new aging rooms, buy new cheese vats, and really make substantial investments in our infrastructure. Fortunately, my husband's and my day jobs and the income that's now coming from the farm enable us to make those investments. The challenges are mainly making enough cheese. We can't do online sales yet because we can't tell our customers, well, no, we're out of this cheese. We have to have the cheeses to sell. The fuel expenses, we have several employees who are incredible, and we have to pay workman's comp, 15 cents for every dollar that they earn. We pay in insurance, and that's great because if anything happens, we're all covered, but it's a huge amount of money for a small farm. Our annual income last year our gross income was $500,000. 200,000 of that went out to labor, and the rest went out to cheese making and milk purchases, and we broke even. That was the second year in a row we broke even in 7 years of business. With upping our production, we hope that we'll have profit and be able to plow that profit back into the business. I think we'll cap out our production at 100,000 pounds of cheese in the next 3 to 4 years. We don't want to become a factory. We are now able to, with the help of the NRCS branch of the USDA, we are now looking at exploiting, in the good sense, all of our other farm assets, raising pigs. We have put in a flock of 100 chickens who not just because we want to sell eggs, but because we rotate our animals every 12 hours. So the goats and the cows come in for milking, and they are taken out to a new pasture. Goats in particular are incredibly prone to parasites. If we put chickens moving on a sled-like house in the pasture after the goats, they will woof up all the parasites and and scratch the ground and rejuvenate it. The goats are only on repeat portions of pasture every 90 days. We're lucky we have a lot of land and we can do that sort of careful rotation. And goats provide only seasonal income. We don't milk goats from November until April, so we have the cow supply to provide cheese all year long. New York City has 45 farmers markets, green markets. We go to 7 of them. We have a guy in New York City who's in charge of all of that, and we truck the cheese down there every Tuesday. We are at 7 markets in Vermont, farmers markets in Vermont, and 1 in Lenox, Massachusetts. We're really committed to farmers markets. Once we got to the point where we won an American Cheese Society medal and we got noticed by wholesalers, we're starting to balance our income between wholesale and direct to consumer. Right now, we're looking at something that could be incredibly difficult for the entire artisanal cheese world, which is the investigation of raw milk. We make only raw milk cheeses, and the FDA is found Listeria in 3 different plants in late 2010, and the entire artisanal cheese business is looking to make its #1 priority food safety so that we can continue this really powerful new tradition of Americans making their own raw milk cheeses that are safe to eat and delicious. And thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And I'm really glad that the conference is also going to, that we're going to talk about fisheries. And so Angela Sanfilippo is now going to tell us about the Cape Ann Fresh Catch Program.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me down here today. My name is Angela Sanfilippo, and I'm the president of the Gloucester Fisherman's Wife. Gloucester is the city of Captain Courageous and the perfect storm. But Gloucester has been the city that has fed the people of New England for 400 years with its great bounty that comes from the ocean. Actually, the whole New England area has had this great privilege of this food. But before I go on, I just want to tell you one thing. Remember that right now, 85% of the fish that's consumed in the United States, it's imported from other countries where we have no knowledge under which environmental condition. And if you look at the United States and see how much we are surrounded by the ocean, ask yourself a question then, why is only 15% produced in the United States? It was in the late 60s that a group of women who were daughters of immigrants from Sicily that came to Gloucester to fish that realized that they were losing this food supply. They were losing it to the world because the whole world was fishing in the Atlantic Ocean. And their husbands were out fishing for longer days, bringing a smaller catch. With that knowledge, they set up to organize themselves and ask Congress to pass a law called the Magnuson-Stevens Act so that United States can have a jurisdiction out to 200 miles and create the exclusive economic zone, which meant that no foreign vessel could have fished within 200 miles of the United States coastline. It took them 8 years. These women who didn't have more than 5th grade education find themselves in the Hall of Senate and Congress to testify. And in 1976, this law was passed. Excuse me, I have a cough that's really bothering me. I need some water. I'm sorry. But with this, many challenges came because the law also said, well, the damage that was done by the foreigners has to be repaired, and it's the American fishermen. I'm so sorry. And years were tough. In the late 70s, when the law was first approached, much needed to be done. The fishing fleet was old, and there was no way, and also the infrastructure for handling more fish did not exist anymore, as it had been lost. But these women never gave up. They kept working very hard, and they decided that one thing they needed to do was to educate the American public to eat everything that comes out of the ocean, and not just those species such as haddock and cod and flounder and lobsters. That there was so much more that people could eat. Thank you. I'm so sorry. And the first thing they did to educate people was they got together with another women's group called the League of Women's Voters, and they created a cookbook called The Taste of Gloucester. Because of their background, and today as we've been listening, culture has a lot to do with it. Remember, these were women who, some of them immigrants themselves and some daughters of immigrants from Sicily, where everything that comes from the ocean is eaten and it's so much valued. They got all their mothers' and grandmothers' recipes, and they created this cookbook for what was called back then underutilized species. With that book, they just set out and went out and promote and educate people everywhere. Hospital, university, colleges, you name them, and there they were with their cookbook and their fish to promote this. But at the same time, they also kept their eyes on the prize, which was the ocean. The ocean needs to reproduce. The ocean needs to be kept clean. So in the 80s, they really went to war, and they managed to get the Ocean Dumping Act that took place in 1987, because their belief is, and at that time I had joined them, that the ocean needs to be clean to reproduce. And we can allow the ocean to be used as a dump site. That was a battle, but we won it. Fish farming was being introduced, and they wanted to take fishing grounds to establish these fish farms. Again, was a battle, but we won. They wanted to create tire reef, all the stuff in the ocean, thin and gravel mining, and the biggest battle of oil drilling on Georges Bank. Georges Bank is the biggest fishing ground in the world that is within 60 miles of Gloucester and the New England area, that produces every type of species in the world that you can think. That battle was a bitter one that we fought for 10 years, but in 1989, Congress passed a ban on oil drilling on Georges Bank. By the late 1980s, things were okay. The food was coming in, and what happened then was all at once fishermen started saying something is happening to the ocean. And the fisherman's wife went to the bodies of regulators and said, we need to do something. We need to increase our mesh size. We do, because fishermen are saying something is happening. It took 5 years before we could have had some stricter regulations. And by then, in the mid-90s, things were tough. The fish wasn't there, and we knew about it, and we wanted really to do something. And we had to sacrifice almost 50% of the industry to allow this industry to rebuild. Many people left the fishing industry. In the year 2000, things were very good again. And so we had all the hopes and dreams of a better future. But according to the rules and regulation, all this publicity was made about that still the ocean were empty, and people were encouraged to use foreign imports, that we have suffered tremendously. And regulations still keep getting tight. So it was 2 years ago that we really wanted the people in our community to have the seafood, because we knew it was there. And it was to our great surprise, a friend of ours, her name is Niaz Doric, she's the executive director of the North Atlantic Marine Alliance, came to us with an idea. She said, you know, Angela, up in Port Cline, Maine, the fishermen have so little fish to catch that they've started to do like a direct marketing to the people around that area. It's called a community-supported fishery, just like community-supported agriculture. What do you think? You think you would like to do it in Gloucester? The fisherman's wife have always tried to allow people in the community to eat the seafood. So we entertained the idea, and it took us like 6 months. We actually didn't have a dime to start this. We needed a refrigerator truck, we needed computers, we needed to do outreach. But in the spring of that year, in 2009, we knew what was the regulation were going to change, and it would have been harder to get this food to the people. We launched the program. And to our great surprise, in June of 2009, we started our community-supported fishery called CSF. We had 750 shareholders. What is people, we do 4 seasons a year, and people buy into a season so much per pound of fish, and every week, on the same day, at the same time, in the same location, we deliver this fish. The first year, we really promoted whole fish, because when you fillet a fish, you lose 60%, which is really a shame. It's good, edible fish. And we did well. But the people said, you know, we work, we come home, it's late, we don't have the time to fillet or to cook a whole fish. So we would really like to get the same quality fish in a fillet form. So in the summer 2010, we introduced, working with our local processors, we introduced the fillet shares. It was a successful summer, and we're going to start a new season starting Monday, where already 650 people have signed. What we learned from the CSF is that people, once exposed to good quality seafood, they appreciate it, they value. As a matter of fact, we've had people who have said, you know, this season I'm not going to join. 3 weeks later, they call us and say, can we please join now, because we cannot get this product anywhere. We are luckier in a way different than the farmer's market, because we don't just have fish in a season and not in another season, because as I said, we are in a great geographic location, so we could really take people in at any time that they are want to take part in this. We have not done much public advertise about this. It's only through the same people who advertise for us. A friend tells a friend, and that's how we have kept growing. We've been contacted now a lot by restaurants. We're going to be working with them in the summer season. How do the fishermen benefit from this? We pay them a higher price than what they normally would get. And we have a fish auction in Gloucester, and the price comes out of the fish auction. So if today the price is $1 for hake, we'll be paying the fishermen $2.50. Today, we can tell you that no longer the top fish are haddock, cod, flounder, and lobster, but today it's pollock and squid and mackerel and monkfish and hake and whiting and skate, only because we went out and educated people. One year, we were invited at the Smithsonian Institute here in Washington. And we came down to do a promotion of herring as a food fish, because herring is always be considered as trash fish. We made 1,000 fish cakes. And lucky for us, we had two groups of school children that just came by us, and we were wiped out in an hour. And we spent the rest of the time enjoying ourselves in Washington. So how much time do I have? Okay. The program, the CSF, is really put us in touch with the farmers because in many places we deliver the fish into a farmer's market. We get a volunteer, and what we do, we give them a free share of the fish, and they mind the coolers for us. In some places, we stay with the refrigerator truck and give out the fish. Every morning, we will email the people who are to pick up fish that day, and we tell them where they're getting, which boat it came out from, and we give them recipes. We have 2 cookbooks, like I said, the Taste of Gloucester, and in 2005 we published another cookbook called Stories and Recipes, and it's the stories of 16 fishermen's wives who've done all this work for the last 42 years. They will be on sale here this afternoon. We have great hopes now that we have a very educated group of people. We have a database of 3,000 people. We put in little newspaper articles that come out about the fisheries. We try to educate them on the value of this seafood that we have. Unfortunately, in closing, let me tell you this. Our challenges are going to be big because now that we rebuild the fisheries, the rules and regulation for the fisheries are that it's become an open market commodities. People can buy and sell their quota. And eventually, like has been happening in other parts of the world, this fish will be owned by very few people. And the traditional fishermen in community like Gloucester and New Bedford and up and down the coastline will be gone. It's not over yet. And we will fight until the end. But educating people is the most important thing. This is a resource that belongs to all the people of the United States. It doesn't belong to us or a private company. And people of the United States have the right to come from Vermont and be able to eat this fish. We are so lucky that the fishing grounds are close to us. The boats go out like at 2 o'clock in the morning, and by 6 o'clock in the morning, they come back with their fresh catch, and that's the fish that we sell for our CSF. There is a great amount of bounty. We will keep protecting the ocean as well as we can, but we need the consumers that when they go out and need a piece of fish at the restaurant, they need to ask, where is this fish from? Because 85% of our seafood is imported. Only 1% gets inspected and rejected. We have a lot of work ahead of us to eat our local fish. Thank you for your...
Thank you so much, Angela. Our last speaker is Rose Koenig from the University of Florida, and Rose will be our last speaker, so we will have some time for questions. I'm sure there are some that have developed.
I just wanted to say that being, I guess, affiliated from the University of Florida is a more recent experience for me. I grew up on a farm in New Jersey, a vegetable farm, so I grew up in a household where 100% of our income came from farming. And then I farmed after I got my PhD in Gainesville for 16 years. So recently have gone back to the university for a lot of reasons, part of which has been mentioned already here at the presentations. It's to really grow the next generation of farmers. So going back to educating people about agriculture, and more importantly, this new inspired generation of young people who are interested in farming. And also, I've had the pleasure these past 2 years since I've been teaching to sort of mentor a new couple on our farm who basically took over our CSA and are continuing to do a fine job, but I've had the ability to sort of look and see some of the challenges that they face, even with all the enthusiasm and hard work that they're putting into the farm, they are presented with different challenges than I was presented with, and I wanted to discuss some of those challenges in my presentation. So first I want to ask you, a group of people I think that hopefully are interested in food, either that or there's nothing going on in your lives and you decided to come over for this afternoon session. So I'm hoping we're going to get some good answers to these questions, that you're going to get 100% on this test. You can see I'm putting on my professor hat right now. But so basically I'm going to ask you a few questions. I'm going to give you some options, and I want you to raise your hand so I can see how smart you are. So wheat, rice, and maize provide, and you're going to either a quarter of all the energy of the human diet, a third of the energy of the human diet, a half, or 2/3. So those are your choices. So how many people think it's a quarter? Nobody. A third of our energy. One person in the back. 2/3? Oh, good. And 1/2. Okay, very good. You got it right. You guys have to be in my class. You can come and teach. A lot of students don't know that. Okay, to meet the food demands of the world population, this is in the future, we will need to increase our yields by, and this is when we hit the 9 billion mark, 25%, 50%, 75%, or 100%. So 25%, a couple hands, 50%, a few more, 75%, and then 100%. Oh, gotcha there. So it's about 75%, but you're right, it's a lot, okay? How about organic production? Is it 2% of approximately 2% of our production, 10% of our production, 20% of our food production in the U.S., or 30% production in the U.S.? How many people think it's about 2%? Yep. Okay, so you got that. And then finally, how many people do you think account for farmers, in terms of 75% of agriculture production based on a dollar value? So how many farmers do you think actually produce 75% of that agriculture dollar value in the U.S.? Is it 125,000, 250,000, 500,000 farmers, or 1 million farmers? 125,000, 250,000, 500,000, or 1 million. So it's 125,000. So you guys are a very educated group of people. And if you think about some of those statistics or some of those facts, and it's really it's going to be an incredible challenge to create a sustainable food system in the future. I think some of this local production is certainly an element of that, but it certainly, I think most of you would probably agree, based on those statistics, that it's not the sole answer. There's not many things that are going to be quickly fixed, or there's not many single solutions to a problem, especially a problem that is so extensive, of trying to figure out how to increase the sustainability of our food supply. And just note that I said increase the sustainability. I think that we can go down the road thinking that we haven't made great progress. Yes, there's problems. We can look at problems in any kind of industry, but some of the solutions that were presented by, I think, well-intentioned people throughout the history of agriculture only turned out later, that we look back. It's always, when you're blessed with the ability to sort of look back in time, it's easy to point fingers. It's more difficult when you're facing those challenges to try to really think about the complexities of your solutions, to really understand what the potential outcomes of those solutions are. So I think that that's one thing that's really important for me in terms of teaching, is trying to develop sort of critical thinking skills among sort of the policymakers and the future educators, the future farmers, in terms of how do you deal with sustainability. And I'm not sure as a species I think we're capable, we have the knowledge, but it is very complex. These are not easy. They're not going to be quick fix solutions. And I think the bigger challenge to you, I didn't ask you, how many of you are farmers? A few of you. In my opinion, the solution exists with you. It doesn't exist in agriculture. Because we have a capitalist society, fortunately or unfortunately, most growers are going to do what consumers are going to tell us to do, because we only make up less than 1% of the population, the ones that are producing food. So the other 99% have an incredible amount of power, And a lot of the decision making that happens in the household or in the communities really impact sort of what the growers turn around and do, or whether they're able to make a living, or they're developing some of these sustainable fishing enterprises. So our food system, which you probably know, is a bimodal food system, and maybe that is the neo-caloric model. We've seen for the first time in the latest census that there are more farmers. We've grown more farmers, in part because of the statistic that we're counting people that make, $1,000 as farmers. That's how you grow sort of those numbers. But nevertheless, there are groups of people. Many of them are retired. Many of them are coming to farms with no background in agriculture that are sort of trying it out. And they're filling up those small categories, people that are making less than $10,000 or $5,000 a year in farming. But we're also growing another group of farmers, and those are the really large-scale producers that are producing the vast majority of the food for the U.S. And we can't look and solve problems without addressing the needs and the constraints and the obstacles for those two groups. They're not the same. They're not serving the same kinds of people. They're not growing in the same regions typically. So as we think about these things, we need to think about not necessarily scale, but why things occur in different areas. And if you look at the food systems, there's a reason why there's vegetable productions around urban areas and in sometimes drier Mediterranean climates like California, and they're not in other areas. And there's a reason why you grow citrus and sugarcane down in Florida and you can't grow it up in Maine. So there's a lot of reasons why our food systems look a certain way. So there's some realistic things that we can do to sort of grow our local food systems. And then there's certain things that are impossible sometimes to do because of those environmental constraints or where a particular person is. So sort of this idea that we can make, we can quick fix it, I just don't think is going to be a possibility. So I wanted to talk about and I guess reinforce the 5 areas of sustainable production that I think are going to be the greatest challenges. Some of them have been mentioned already, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Certainly is production systems that enhance soil quality. It's key to so many of the challenges that we're going to face. It's key on helping use natural cycles for nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus. And it's key in terms of conserving water, which comes to my second area of sustainability. Water consumption, agriculture is the biggest water consumption user in the U.S. 80 to 90% of water is used by agriculture. So based on that statistic, you can see where water is going to be a key issue in the future, and agriculture, because of its use, is going to be looked at and challenged in terms of making its water use more sustainable. Also, production systems are going to need to be more resilient because of the challenges that we're going to face with climate changes. There's going to be, I would predict in the future, there's going to be areas that are going to be winners and losers with climate change. The good thing about CO2 production is that plants actually use it, so it can make plants in some ways more efficient. It can drive photosynthesis. The problem with it is it creates really erratic conditions for people to grow in, and it changes pest pressures. So there are going to be winners and losers. That's the predictions of climate change. So the problem is who's losing, how are they going to sustain their food production? So it will be a challenge that we as a global nation, nation or citizens are going to have to deal with. And then finally, there's that's the thing that I really want to focus on till the end of my talk is the challenge of human capital. And I think we talked about some of this human capital already, but first of all, with 1% of our nation producing food, that means that there's not a whole lot of farm kids that are leaving the farm and coming back to be educated to be farmers. And because we have such complexities that we have to deal with in agriculture, we need a lot of really, really smart people going into agriculture. And fortunately, at the University of Florida, we're one of the largest institutions in the country. We're one of the largest agriculture institutions in the country, although the agriculture college within the university is fairly small, and the number of students majoring in agriculture is really minimal. So that's a challenge. But even with all those smart students, most of them want to go into the medical profession. They're not interested in agriculture. They're not going to make enough money in agriculture production. They see it as farming. So it's really changing the way that we market sort of agriculture from something that is, you know, sitting on a John Deere tractor and low income, and yeah, you got to work really hard and you're not going to make a lot of money. Those messages don't go over well with the young population that I'm dealing with, okay? They're just taking the class for the fun of it. You know, I like to think that we are growing a young generation of farmers, but once they get into it and they see that they're not going to be able to afford health insurance, and they are not going to have a retirement, they will not stay in the profession. So that's where the consumers come in. If you look at U.S. food policy, most food policy, contrary to what farmers think, have been driven, it's designed for cheap food. It's designed for consumers. It's not designed to necessarily help farmers. I mean, if they get helped along the way, that's a terrific thing. So consumers, because of that driving of sort of the policy end of it, you again have a lot of power. And the things that you have to think about in terms of the food system is that if we do look at some of these sustainable models, like we try to grow more small farmers who may not have the skill level, or they may just want to grow really high valued crops because that's the way they can get their 401k, or they figure out it's the way that they can retire, it means that in the short run, we may have decreasing production in food. We also more likely are going to spend more money on food. We'll probably have less disposable income because we are the one country that spends the less money of our total income on food. So there's less disposable income that will impact sort of the other elements of our society, or how we may not be buying as many iPods or iPads or all those kinds of things. Some of the technologies that many green folks in the room probably don't like may be a reality in the future, like biotechnology, because that same technology that people are saying is corporate technology also can be used to help with drought tolerance. It also can be used to do disease resistance. It also can be used to nutritionally enhance foods. So that's something that we need to consider as a society. We may need more farmers. We're likely going to need more land to farm, which means we're going to have to take natural lands. We're probably not going to come to Washington, D.C. and knock the buildings down. It would be a very stupid thing to do. But we probably could go onto a lot of the natural lands and start farming them again. And that's what happened prior to 1900, when we went into intensification of agriculture. We'll probably have to supply more food aid for developing countries, because many of them are predicted to have negative impacts on climate change. And then, more importantly, and it's kind of a sad thing, I'll leave it at that. Well, two more things. We may have to choose between growing food or fuel, but we probably can't do both. We're probably going to have to redesign our farms so that there's certain production around urban areas that make sense. We're going to certainly have to diversify our diet. And the one thing I'd like to leave with you is we may have to think about the money that we're spending as a society to extend our life expectancy. We may have to reconsider that and start spending it on investing in our public institutions and our research to figure out how we're going to feed the young people and the people, especially in developing countries, that will probably be greatly impacted by food production or the lack thereof. So there's a lot of challenges, and some of those are challenges that a lot of people don't want to think about. But those are going to be some of the challenges that I believe we're going to have to face to make agriculture more sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. So we've got about a little over 10 minutes for some questions, so I'd open the floor. Please, here.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. In terms of the young farmers, where are they going to get the money to buy the farms? I mean, this whole business of the economic thing, how do they accumulate enough to basically buy a farm?
Well, I'll start on that. One thing is that there's a little bit of a movement among young farmers to lease. And there's a lot of land that is still agricultural, that's agriculturally viable. It might need some restoration, it might need the soil built up, but there's a lot of people who used to farm, they've gone to town, or they even live there. But anyway, the point is there's available land in many, many rural communities, and a lot of those people who own it are not just looking for top dollar, they're looking for somebody to sustain it in something like what they knew it as. And so that opens up a whole world of possibilities of people leasing land, maybe for many years, maybe for their whole career farming, but certainly during that startup phase. And I think that's something we're just beginning to be a little bit focused on, but has tremendous potential to kind of overcome the land problem.
I think another thing, in this afternoon's panel, we've got a discussion in the food and finance section. Gary Mateson is here from Farm Credit Council to talk about some of those issues.
Yeah, I think that people can worry sometimes. Capital, getting money is a difficult thing, don't get me wrong, but there are ways in the society through loan programs, through policies that that are in place for people who can show that they have the ability to farm, I think, to get started in the business. It's not easy. The bigger issue, I think that people are forgetting about, it's that human capacity building. I mean, I see on our farm, college-educated students, they weren't educated in agriculture, trying to figure things out as they go. And that's not to say that you can't do. Plenty of people don't have a college education and they farm. It's just now the margins in agriculture are relatively small and the costs are really high. So most young people, if they fail, it's too costly for them, and if it's like, it's complex stuff, especially sustainability. I mean, would you go to a brain surgeon who didn't have training? No. So agriculture, we have to sort of elevate that profession, which again means elevating sort of the appreciation that consumers have for food, and unfortunately, it's going to increase the cost of food. But even if you can buy land, if you can't, at the end of the year, you've only made $15,000. Like the one statistic I forgot to say is that the average statistic for farm income is about $75,000, of which 15%, like 12,000 comes actually from farm for most families. So most farm income is only about $12,000 a year if they're making a profit. How many of you could live on $12,000 a year? That's why most people's have to have somebody that works off the farm, or somebody is subsidizing the farm to get it started. So those are some of the challenges.
In the back and then down front.
Hi, thanks. I'm Cheryl Collin with Full Plate Ventures. Thank you for sharing the challenges and also your inspiring stories of how you've actually overcome a lot of the challenges. My question goes to Anthony. Anthony, you talked about coordinating farmers to figure out growing rotational crops and who's growing what. Can you talk a little bit about the business model around that? Is that a cooperative, or what is the arrangement among the farmers?
So that whole idea of, which is sort of generically called these days aggregation and distribution systems, or value chains is the kind of longer view of it, is unfolding in different ways. There's some of them that are limited liability corporations. Some of them are cooperative in the legal sense. The one that we started, which was one of the early versions, kind of a test case down in Appalachia, was actually an unincorporated network of farmers that was managed by a nonprofit. So the nonprofit provided whatever legal umbrella to get business licenses and things like that. The farmers joined it, I think, in a sense, I think that it doesn't matter too much, the legal form of it. The business model is basically that the farmers come together because they need each other to reach a market. That's kind of the essence of these things. That alone, this is typically, and it is done mostly in fruits and vegetables, but it's also being done in meat. Possibly, I think, in a way, the community-supported fisheries is a similar version of this. But anyway, basically, the kinds of small to medium scale farmers that we're dealing with simply could not get into Ingalls or Martin's or Earth Fare or Whole Foods, which are the places we sell, or Virginia Tech or others on their own. They don't have the scale of production. They certainly can't do the field cooling. They can't do that. So fairly early on, they recognize that they need each other to gain access to what is a very large market, but also relatively well-paying, particularly for a wholesale market. So that's the essence of the business model, is because people ask, well, why would they cooperate? So from there, then, you have all the same challenges that you have, is making distribution affordable, figuring out how far do you go with a product that's kind of a local regional brand. But the system works because of that, and farmers recognize the benefit of that. And then we use a system where we get the weekly demand for about 30 different items of produce, free-range eggs, and now meats. And then that weekly demand is translated into how much production we need. And then from that provides your basis to figure out how much needs to be grown, who's going to grow it. Pricing is figured into that. There's certain crops that buyers want that the price that we negotiate or that they're willing to give is not adequate. So the farmers say, no, we don't want that. But it's all very fluid. But the essence, again, is they need each other to get into these markets. They can't do it on their own. Without that, we couldn't have a cohesive network of farmers.
Please.
On the fishing side, the CSF, it's a program of the fisherman, Gloucester Fisherman's Wife. We are a nonprofit organization. And what happens is people pay us. We have a buyer who also does the processing and the packaging that gets the fish from the boats. And what I forgot to tell you is that in a year and a half, we have brought in Gloucester $1.1 million from this project that has helped tremendously. But people didn't go and do this independently. It's done under the umbrella of the nonprofit organization.
I was going to say there, this dichotomy between sustainable, unsustainable farming has always existed in this country, going back even to colonial times. You had farmers who integrated livestock with their vegetables and their grains and whatnot. They spread the manure, maintained the soil. They were called improvers. Then there were the other guys who saw that as too much work, too expensive. They grew their crops until the soil gave out. They moved on. Land was cheap. It kind of brings to mind a scene in the movie King Corn. I don't know if you remember seeing it, where the guys have disked their fields, they've sprayed their ammonia, they've sprayed the Roundup. They're sitting around the cafe with their coffee, and I think the waitress says, oh, yeah, these guys are here most of the time. So, and having heard your stories about how difficult it is, how do you convince people to go into sustainable farming, or is the world simply going to be inherited by the Amish?
I mean, I don't want to do all the talking here. I'll start and then pass it on. I'm sure you have a perspective on that as well. It's the reality thing. We have a lot of young people that intern on our farm, that we have woofers on our farm. We have more of that happening on other farms. There is this tremendously exciting emergence of young people, not only on farms and in sort of local food system, but actually in local economy stuff, in social change now. We've finally, the older folks like us are going to be able to step aside. But I think that the truth of it is you have to convey both the pleasure of it and the tremendously hard work. It's part of redefining what gives us satisfaction, and for many people that's like a ridiculous sort of notion, but it is happening in practice. Wendell Berry, one of his many great essays, he talks about how his 11-year-old daughter, this is years ago, was working the tobacco field in a hot day, and at the end of it she talked about the great satisfaction and pleasure she got when a cool breeze came up and that sort of broke the 90-degree heat. Again, that doesn't ring true for an awful lot of young people, but I think the exciting thing is that for a fairly big group of young people now, those finding small pleasures in productive work of whatever sort, including farm work, is actually kind of hip now, and actually is more than just a fad. I think people are beginning to redefine their lives. I think part of the economic crisis we just had was that people did, at least briefly, pause from the kind of constant consumption and growth model to think maybe there's another way. So, it's a hard nut to crack, but I think there is an emerging sense that we need to redefine prosperity and happiness, and some of that might mean this.
My feeling is, again, and that's why I was trying to, I think that these movies are great in terms of developing awareness. I think that we have to be really careful. I think that sustainability, again, that in that bimodal, area, in my opinion, and there's probably people in the room that would argue, there's a lot of sustainable farmers that are large farmers. There's a lot of farmers in the Midwest that are building more soil organic matter than most organic vegetable producers because of no-till agriculture that they're employing on their farms. So I think that as a collective group of thinkers, we need to identify the practices and be able to measure them, and then pay people for those practices, and get out of the mindset of labeling farmers as being sustainable. It's about practices. It's more about practices than the size and who they are and whether they're growing corn or whether they're growing vegetables. I think we can fall into the notion that somebody's ideal, but I know a lot, and I'm not trying to degrade small growers. I am one, but I know a lot of small producers that they take on interns, they don't give them adequate housing, and they don't pay them. So that's not economic justice for workers. Whereas there are some large growers that are giving their workers retirement plans. So I think that we need to look at individual practices rather than label operations or operators.
Angela, did you have a comment you wanted to make?
No. Which Angela? This Angela? Yeah.
There's so many Angelas here. I think it's up to farmers like my husband and myself who have the means to provide on a small scale a living for not only our workers but our partner farms. And we find people coming to us all the time who are from multi-generational farms, so they have farm in their DNA. They want to work outside. They want to work with animals. They can call, if they can't get the answer from me, even though I have a steep learning curve, they can call Dad, and here's what Dad says you can do with this sick calf. I think you find a certain kind of person who can really stick it out. During kidding season, which has started now, I might sleep out in the barn 5 nights a week, and then the kids who are working on the farm, I have 2 farm managers who are 26-year-old couple, they're working day and night to birth all these babies and keep them healthy and whatnot. So you just have to, it's trial and error. You get a lot of people coming to the farm wanting to work on farms. Some of them see poop on the floor and freak out or find out there's nothing to do at night on a farm in Vermont. But you get the others who find that they love it. And I think it's about love and passion for food and caring about feeding people on a small scale and maybe a larger scale and larger as good things happen on farms.
I think we're going to let that be the last word on this session, so please thank the panel again.